So on to panel 2. So it's my enormous pleasure to introduce here, again on behalf of the Harvard Law School, the Criminal Justice Program of Study, the Vera Institute, Cyrus Vance Jr. and John Chisholm. Cyrus Vance Jr. is the district attorney in New York County, which is Manhattan. He's been the district attorney since 2010. He actually started his career in the district attorney's office, working as an ADA starting in 1982. In 1988, he escaped New York and moved to Seattle. And he co-founded a law firm there and also taught at the Seattle University School of Law. And then in 2004, he was pulled back to New York and joined a firm in New York. And then in 2009 ran for district attorney, was elected, and is now the district attorney. In addition to being, as you've probably already sensed for those of you who were here for the prior panel, in addition to being the district attorney, he's also been involved in a lot of criminal justice reform programs involving sentencing reform, conviction integrity, prosecutorial oversight, and we'll talk about some of those things. John Chisholm is the district attorney in Milwaukee. After graduating from college, he served in the Army for 3 years, then went to law school in Wisconsin, and then has been a career prosecutor. Started as an ADA in Milwaukee in 1994. In 1999, he became the supervisor of the office's gun crime unit, and then in 2007 became the district attorney in Milwaukee. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So you were both in the room for the prior panel, which was about the Vera Institute's study in partnership with the district attorney's office in New York, Danny, as it's called. I've learned. For a while, I thought that was a person, and then I realized. And in the presentation, there's also a reference to partnerships with with John Chisholm's office in Milwaukee. So to start off, could you share your thoughts about that study, about what it revealed, about what you think can be done, what steps need to be done, and also if you could talk not just about your offices, but do you think this is reproducible across the country? Are there other offices? As you heard in the prior panel, part of this, the idea was to be a model for other offices. Is that successful? Do you think that will happen?
To me?
Yeah, if you could start and then John can jump in.
Well, thank you, Harvard, for inviting me up here. John, it's great to see you. And Leroy Frazier, my colleague now in Brooklyn, it's great to see you and your colleagues. Well, I'd start answering the second point first. I think there is a big shift in the prosecution community at the state level. I think also at the federal level, but I can just say at the state level. I think we all understand much better than we did, or at least I did when I was a prosecutor in the 1980s, that crime prevention, for example, is an essential crime-fighting tool in our desire to make crime decline. And things that go along with crime prevention aren't they are not the typical levers and tools that we would have used in a DA's office in the 1980s. So what we're doing in Manhattan, for example, what Nitin's described, and I give Nitin enormous credit for implementing those programs, which I think are imaginative, forward-thinking, and certainly not my father's DA's office. This is happening in a lot of jurisdictions. And it's been over time. When I ran for DA, I called John in Milwaukee when I was a candidate. And I, in getting ready for running for DA, was looking at what they were doing in San Francisco and in Milwaukee and in Dallas with the country's first conviction integrity unit. So there has been an acceleration of change in DA's offices all over the country. It doesn't mean there's not a lot to be done more, but I feel going to meetings of my fellow prosecutors at the American Prosecutors Association, I think we're doing a lot that's better, that is new, and is more effective, and is going to enable us to enhance safety without sacrificing fairness, which I think is ultimately my job. And the first question was, what did I learn out of this?
Yeah, and what? How did you react to it? And Nitin described a lot of the things that your office has done in response. What would you like to see done in your office?
Well, I think I was the desire to have Vera come in and conduct this review was my desire, and it preceded me becoming DA. But I think it became all the more important to me while I was running for DA, and then after I became DA, to have Vera conduct this study, because we are all, prosecutor's office and our office in New York, we are critical players in the criminal justice system. Therefore, what we do is going to have an impact on the fairness of the operating of our justice system. And I found that it was difficult for me to comment upon the work of other agencies in the criminal justice arena as it pertained to race without ourselves first having an understanding of where we were and what we were doing and whether it could be improved. It took a long time, as these studies do. I think actually I met with Nick's predecessor probably 2010, but at the end product, I was very pleased to have Vera complete its work. The work revealed to me that information I did not know previously. That is, there are statistical differences that were meaningful, that we needed to focus on, and it enabled us pretty quickly to address some of the questions directly that Vera had raised. How do we divert from prosecution in a responsible way, first-time offenders, to the communities and community sanction? That will have a direct relation to what was, what Vera called for, which is how many people are coming into the system. The moving from criminal court to summons part, not a diversion, but a moving of a large number, thousands of cases, to essentially a non-criminal resolution. Again, no one likes to get a summons, but you like to get arrested even less. And the summons is, I think, for these kinds of offenses range from marijuana to riding your bike on the sidewalk, to drinking, having an open can of beer that's not covered. These things were coming to our criminal courts that simply didn't belong there. But you really need, I think, this process of moving them out of a criminal posture and into something else other than criminal really requires the police department's buy-in, because otherwise you are fighting a 25 to 30,000 case wall each year. If those cases amount to 20,000, that's not ideal. But if you can have the police department acknowledge that this is a better way to do business, and with the new commissioner we have in New York, he has acknowledged that this is the way he wants to do business, I think we will be able to address many of the underlying issues in the Vera report in terms of dealing with incoming cases. As to our own procedures in the office and how we handle them, I was very glad to know the information. And now, as Nitin indicated, we are able to run numbers to assess whether we made any improvements since the Vera report data was provided to them. We are able to focus on what should implicit bias training look like in our office, and recognize, as I do at least, that we all have biases, and it's not something that we should be afraid of talking about or studying. So Vera's report was long in coming, in my mind, was extremely well done in its operation, and I think was significant in helping us understand better ways to manage cases that were coming in, and gave us self-awareness that we didn't previously have to say we need to continue to look within and make sure that our thinking about how we're handling criminal justice is informed.
Okay. John, can you talk about your reaction to the study and also your participation in earlier projects with Vera or cooperation with Vera that led you to be a model in this area?
Sure. I can just start off by saying we've come light years. It seems like when I first started talking with Vera in 2005, 2006 about this project, you have to understand that the Milwaukee DA's office at that point in time was a paper-based system. 2005, paper-based system. And I'd make the argument, you have to keep in mind, there is no such thing as a criminal justice system in the United States. You've had probably about 3,200 different criminal justice systems of various sizes, various resourcing, various technical capabilities. At the time that Vera first approached us, we were sort of middle of the pack, as it were. We at least had computers, and we were keeping, each individual unit in the office was keeping some data, and we could cross-link that with a state system, the circuit court automated programs. But there wasn't a unified case management system. And ironically, it was actually Vera coming in, and we're the largest jurisdiction in the state of Wisconsin. We have about 28% of the prosecutors, about 54% of the violent crime occurs in the city of Milwaukee. We're definitely get the majority of the attention, but we are also going to get upgraded with a case management system sometime around 2012 is what they were telling us in 2005. When Vera came in and basically blackmailed the state, they basically said, look, we're going to start collecting data and we're going to give the Milwaukee DA's office their own case management system unless you want to step in beforehand and do something about that. Now, within a year, the state came to the table, and Vera was actually able to inform the data that would be collected by our case management system. So, but the amazing thing about it is 8 years later, the young people in my office, they just take this for granted. They truly take it for granted, and I've hired a lot of them. So I've got an office of 120 prosecutors. I've hired over 85 of them in the last 8 years. They take for granted that we have a case management system. You really can't take it for granted. So I only preface that by saying that you can't change what you don't measure. And if you don't have something, some capability of effectively measuring, that you're always going to be walking around in the dark and hoping for the best. What prompted me to make a commitment to doing this was that the national and the local studies were absolutely clear. The state of Wisconsin has one of the highest disparity rates for incarceration for African Americans in the country. And that is troubling. And obviously, the concentration of African Americans in the state of Wisconsin is in the city of Milwaukee. That's my community. It's deeply impacted by crime issues. And as a consequence, both for historical reasons and in practical terms, people were concerned about that and wanted something to be done for it, done about that. But at the same time, they want us to keep them safe. They want us to keep them safe, and they want us to do so in a way that respects their constitutional rights. So how you go about that it can be deeply informed by having access to this information, but more importantly, having a relationship with academic entities, with institutions like Vera, and since that time, we've kind of opened our doors to work with just about anybody that's willing to work with us and help us improve the system, because that's our objective commitment is let's measure ourselves. If there's things that we are doing that are not effective, they're not keeping people safe as they could, and they're not wisely using resources, and they're potentially treating people unfairly, it's our obligation to change that. So when I heard that Cy was willing to commit to the Vera program with his office, I thought that was enormously significant, and I thought it was an act of courage because I also knew that he had at least more robust case management capabilities, that Vera was not going to have to spend as much time just kind of working from the ground up and developing the information. And I thought that there was a potential, since other things were going on, as they always are, that once the data came out, it could be spun in a way that would be politically very negative. And that's what you always have to address when you're taking on these issues as an elected official. It's the political risk that comes with it. And that's why, quite frankly, a lot of prosecutors are not particularly interested in taking on the issue. Unless somebody leads the way, it's not going to happen. So I thought what Cy did took an enormous amount of courage.
Thank you. I believe that prosecutors have been slow to appreciate that if they are doing good work, that it often takes an outside validator, not themselves just saying it, to make the case. And prosecutors are historically, I think, conservative on criminal justice issues, but also conservative and not necessarily adventuresome on knowing how to get how to air issues and get their programs validated in a way that they can address the problem the issue presents, but also promotes the way that their office is dealing with the problem. And I now see, like ourselves, there are prosecutors who are bringing outside experts in to study what's happening. And then that study is really a powerful talking point, or a more powerful talking point to prosecutors when they're talking about what they're doing in their job, or how it's working and how it's not working. So I think this is also just part of us getting smarter about how to communicate about things that matter to us and about things that we care about going forward.
So John, we heard a little bit what's being done in New York to try to address some of these issues. Are there concrete steps that you've been able to take in your office to start to address some of the things that we've been talking about, the disparity issues?
Yeah, no question about it. So once the information was presented to us, what was most important to me, quite frankly, is that look, you're never going to be able to address it on an individual case-by-case basis. That's just not practical. But what it pointed out was a need for an entirely different approach to system change, and to do that in an informed, evidence-driven way, and to use the best practices and information out there to hopefully redesign the entire system. So starting with the disparities, particularly in the low-level drug offenses that were uncovered by the Vera study, I was able to take that to our community justice professionals. We developed at the exact same time a community justice council, which is it's a pretty basic concept, but it's a good concept. It says that you sit down with your chief judge, your sheriff, your police chief, the head of the public defender's office, the county executive, the mayor. You meet on a at least monthly basis, and you look at the data related to your criminal justice system, and you figure out ways to improve it. And then you invite people from outside in to help you do that. We worked very closely with the National Institute of Corrections, and one of the first things that I advocated for is, again, we did not have a drug treatment court in Milwaukee County until 2009. That's nothing to be proud of, but basically, using the data from Vera, I was able to say, look, we've got a problem here, particularly as it relates to lower level drug offenses, and we need to take a different approach to it. And we had tried, quite frankly, a drug treatment, what we called the drug treatment approach. What it was taking 17, 18, 19-year-old drug dealers and putting them through a treatment court, and we had about a 90% failure rate, right? Well, that's what happens when you don't listen to professionals and build something on evidence about what actually works. It's useful to have actual addicted people in a drug treatment court as opposed to drug dealers who have very little interest in a drug treatment program and therefore fail. And that's what we used as a system for about 10 years to say, well, we tried that. It was a complete failure. When you bring outside experts in and you set it up along lines that really work, it makes a difference. So what came out of the Vera study was a full commitment to rationally assessing the people that come into our system. So we now have what's called universal screening. That means that every single person that's arrested in Milwaukee County is brought in. If they are detained, they are brought in. They are screened by pretrial professionals. They're given a risk-based score. The public defenders get an opportunity to meet with them. Based on that, I have a team of experienced prosecutors that work with the public defenders to try to figure out which cases can be on a spectrum of outright diversion. That means that they're not even charged. They have to accomplish a couple things designed to address the victim's needs and to address their behavior needs. We can go this intermediate route as a deferred prosecution agreement, which usually lasts 6 to 9 months. Successful completion results in dismissal of the case. And then for our highest risk offenders, and believe me, again, I didn't get this when I first started doing this. I was a line prosecutor. I didn't think in these terms. So when I was first running, I would talk about, well, I think we should take the low risk offenders and put them into a drug treatment court. Well, now what I understand is that what we use our drug treatment court for is for the highest risk offenders, not for violent crimes, but just high risk offenders. These are individuals that but for the drug treatment court are going to prison. And so once we developed that spectrum over the period of years, we saw some significant reductions in the disparity. Now I'll put a warning out to that as well. So one of my goals was also to reduce the incarceration throughout the state, coming from Milwaukee County. We've seen some significant success in doing that, but we haven't necessarily seen the disparity rate go down. So when we first started, we had about 24,000 people incarcerated in the state of Wisconsin. By comparison, the state of Minnesota, our neighboring state, similar demographics, has about 12,000 people in their prison system. So we had about double that. Since we've started this programming in Milwaukee, our incarceration rate has actually gone down about 3,000, 3,500. We're seeing it going in downward trends, and we've maintained lower violent crime rates at the exact same time. So, but the problem with that is that you still have instead of having 750 out of 1,000 being African American, if you have 75 out of 100, you still have a similar disparity rate. But overall, our commitment is to taking different approaches to reduce those problems. And it's not just because I'm aiming at lowering the prison population, it's because this has a significant impact on the stability and sustainability of our neighborhoods and the people that live in those neighborhoods. And taking different approaches, and yet still keeping a very concentrated focus on violent offenders, makes us, quite frankly, a better system and makes our community healthier in the long run. But that's been my perspective on it.
So I want to come back. I want to pick up on the incarceration rate and talk about mass incarceration and sort of shift to that topic. But before I do that, you're both describing a real shift in culture among prosecutors. And I wonder how you've touched a little bit on how you had to you had to be sure to sell that to the police. But what about selling that to the line prosecutors? You just described a kind of perspective of the line prosecutor. How have these initiatives, bringing in outside experts, questioning what you're doing, reviewing, doing the statistics, coming out with these reports, how's that played with your office and your line prosecutors? What have been some of the challenges in that?
I'll go first, but let me just say that what John has been doing and describing in his office, John's been doing this for a long time. And so he really has been on the front end of these kinds of reforms that have guided, as I said before, people like me who are coming in several years later. But it's been the whole way John is dealing with diversion is something that we obviously tried to model also, so I appreciate it. I think coming in as a new district attorney, which I did in 2010, succeeding someone who had been there for 34 years and who was a legendary district attorney, posed some challenges for change. Because if it was good enough for Mr. Morgenthau, why isn't it good enough for you? And I understood that, and I think that's understandable in institutions. But the changes that we have made that I think are, what I would say are, we made a lot of changes, but changes relative to the kind of things we're talking about today, not enforcement, but fairness, I think ultimately have been accepted and accepted well. For example, within the first 4 months of becoming DA, I announced that we were going to create a conviction integrity program. And I think the first reaction from assistants was, who is he, to imply that we lack integrity in our handling of cases. And I understand that, but my advantage was I'd been out practicing for 20 years as a defense lawyer, working around the country, and I understood what I think we understand in this room, is that if you're going to hold yourself off, your office out as a leader in prosecution, in fair and effective prosecution practices, you have to then implement them, and you cannot lead from behind. So we indeed opened up a conviction integrity program 4 or 5 months. It's a very well-structured program. What distinguished it from others is that it's just as important in our program to focus on the front end of cases and not post-conviction review. So I was very interested in learning from the work of Craig Watchin and of the innocence community about what were the statistical relation between a certain kind of case and an error in case assessment. And so we started devising protocols for case review on the front end, particularly guided to what we are expecting younger assistants to capture by way of information when they were reviewing a case with a one witness ID, or protocols in dealing with informants, and how to make those office-wide and more transparent to the senior management in the office to understand who was giving us information. And I think over time, people have accepted and embraced what was the reality, is that more systematic analysis of your cases at the front end, focusing on cases where there are statistically risky factors, risk in decision-making in those cases, makes your case stronger. And to insist on more rigor at the beginning on those kinds of cases in particular, and to provide guidance to young assistants on how to do that and who to go to when they have a question. Ultimately, 4 years later, I think, I believe quite confidently that the office would say that's a really good thing that we started that 4 years ago. And when we announced the Vera results, I'm confident that there were those in the office who felt that it was a criticism of them and a lack of confidence, a lack of my confidence in them. And of course, that is not the case. And I think over time, even though some of these processes are going to be new, such as having consultants come in and train on bias, at the end of the day, I'm absolutely convinced this is good for the institution. It is good to have the office more self-aware, but I believe that it takes time, and it takes consistency, and it takes talented people like Nitin to actually implement these programs, who the lawyers in the office trust a great deal. Therefore, I think it's a challenge, but it's a if you're going to run for DA, you might as well do what you feel you have to do. You're not there for that long.
So Cy and I share one thing in common, and that my predecessor was in the office for about 40 years, E. Michael McCann. I absolutely love and respect him. I wouldn't have stayed in the office for 14 years before running for office if I didn't have complete respect for. He was a leader in ethical prosecution. He brought diversity to our office long before it was a federal mandate. He was one of the first to create a victim witness unit in the country. He sued the Milwaukee Police Department his second year in office in 1970 to force them to turn over discovery. Prior to that, the police officers would just walk into court on the day of trial and give the DA the case file right at that point in time. He sued him, and from that point on, we developed a system of early discovery, open file, and have maintained that since the 1970s. And he was the one that agreed to work with Vera from the get-go. But having said that, Mike also thought that this was a paperweight. He'd be the first to say that. He wouldn't even touch a computer, and so the challenge and within the office, there's no question that there was a strong culture of ethical prosecution. So even to bring in Vera to look at the issue of racial disparity prompted the natural question: what, are you calling us racist? Is that what you're doing? You're calling us racist, Chisholm? And the answer to that, of course, was no. The answer to that was, let's look at ourselves. Let's look at ourselves with as much information as we possibly can. If we see things that help us improve our process, let's take advantage of that opportunity. And again, once, Vera put a lot of time into talking to our experienced people and our less experienced people. They got to know them. They got to understand, they interviewed them, they worked with them, they understood the world that they lived in. And what I found instead of resistance is we got some tremendous positive insights. For example, in looking at the disparities, overall Vera found that there was no significant disparity in our no charge rate throughout the office. When you broke it down into specific categories, there were really significant and troubling ones, like I just mentioned in the lower level drug offenses. Interestingly enough, there was a significant disparity in the number of property-related crimes for, in other words, suburban offenders were charged at a higher rate than central city offenders. And, at first you'd say, well, that's cool because that balances everything out, right? And, but again, it was one of my senior prosecutors that pointed out right away. He said, you know what the problem with that is? That probably reflects that we're devaluing our central city victims. In other words, whether the police aren't investigating them as hard or we're not prosecuting them as hard, it means that, if it's a suburbanite that had their garage broken into, we're taking it more serious than it is if it's somebody from the central city, and we shouldn't be doing that. And that led to some policy changes with respect to how we addressed even property crimes. So I think that what you can take from this, some of it sure is going to be negative, and you have to acknowledge that and come up with ways of changing it. But some of it can just give you better insights into how you serve your victims. It can give you better ideas on just how to process cases more effectively. Having a modern case management system allows me to make sure that one team isn't being overwhelmed with cases while the other team is bored out of their mind. It's just simple things like that engagement with Vera helped us a tremendous amount. And my experience has been working with outside organizations that have nationwide experience and can bring you the studies. It helps it explain it to your partners, and ultimately it helps you explain it to the community. I've worked with both Wayne McKenzie and Whitney in doing that. Just recently, Whitney was in Milwaukee, where we shut down the entire courthouse for an entire day. We had all the public defenders, all the prosecutors, all the judges, and we were taking head on the issue of race. And that's not, believe me, it looked like a community meeting at some point in time with people screaming and yelling at each other, but it's a necessary thing. It's a part of moving forward. And so I think that you can change the culture within your office. I also believe that the role of the prosecutor is just changing. So I've been committed to community-based prosecution now. Since I started, I've been able to expand it, and that gives prosecutors an opportunity to yes, you have to be a competent trial attorney. There's no question about that. And some prosecutors, that's all they want to do. They want to do the homicides, sexual assaults, domestic violence cases. But if you give them opportunities to do other things, actually get out in the community and work with people living in those neighborhoods to help change the dynamics of what's going on in that neighborhood and build up a relationship with people so that they think about prosecutors in a different way, that's exciting. That's exciting for young people. And it gives them a different perspective on what the job is and, quite frankly, what the mission is. We're not case processors. We are not case processors. That's, I've commented a lot recently on a speech that Jeremy Travis from John Jay gave when he came to Marquette, where he says that we suffer under the delusion that the criminal justice system is a funnel, right? It's just a funnel where you put all of society's problems, and that funnel is separate and distinct from all the other vital institutions in our community. We're not. We are not. We are totally dependent on the other vital institutions, whether they're our schools, whether it's our public health system, whether it's our community development system, our faith-based community, our business community. We're totally connected to all of them, and we have to do a better job of bringing them in and doing it in an effective way. That's where I see that we're going to, if we can identify that at-risk population, get to them early enough, then I think we're going to do a much better job of not using overbroad strategies that create disparity. If you use the information technology and just human experience and you work with other entities, you don't have to do broad suppression strategies that cause a lot of disparity. That's all they do, and they cause distrust in the community. If you're stopping people that haven't done anything wrong, and it's very easy for them to think that you're doing it because of improper reasons, even if you actually have a decent reason for doing it.
I'm going to open it up to questions in just a minute, but I wanted to sort of shift over to something that you've both alluded to. Just another major topic in the criminal justice debate now, mass incarceration. We're shifting now, we're in a moment of shift from a long period of tough on crime, lock them up, to an awareness that there is a massive problem of mass incarceration in this country, which has led to some of the initiatives and ideas that you've alluded to. But I think we're just beginning the thinking on this. Can you share with us how you think about this problem, the challenges it poses, the opportunities it poses, how you think we have to think about this problem in a strategic way?
I am daily addressing the reality that 90% of our people in our justice system are Black, Latino, and I am trying to determine how we, as an office, start to address that. And I recognize first that there are things that we can't address as a DA's office that probably bear more on opportunity or lack of opportunity than that may affect mass incarceration. The opportunity for employment, the opportunity for housing, the opportunity for an adequate education. I think those are the foundation stones on which you build a healthy society or it falters. In response to your question, I'd like to focus on one aspect of it which I think actually is not often talked about, but which I think is the underlooked and most important, perhaps the most important thing that we need to do a better job on. As Nitin said, the overwhelming number of our cases are misdemeanor cases. The overwhelming number of people who come in with misdemeanor arrests are people of color. And I believe this is the same probably in 95% of the state jurisdictions around the country, that the large case population is at the lower level, the lower court level. And we simply have not paid enough attention to the resources that we need to devote to this court. This is the court where the 16-year-old will come into or be diverted from. And this is the court where the resources that if that 16-year-old is either diverted or arrested, the resources that are given or not given to that 16-year-old will probably directly relate to whether that 16-year-old comes back again for a second time. And what I see in our court system is that the absence of resourcing at the criminal court level leads to a circumstance where we really don't apply effective enough programming at the first intervention. We don't intervene. We don't apply enough programming at the first arrest. And typically what happens then is the case, nothing really happens to that case except there's a record that now is on file, and that young man or woman will come back in again. And the second time, we really won't do much more. It'll perhaps be a plea to a disorderly conduct because it's the second theft. And then a third time. By the time we pay attention to this young man or woman and actually say, well, we've got to treat this seriously, that person has 4 or 5 misdemeanors and is deemed irredeemable and therefore treated harshly. So I think that the kinds of steps that Nitin talked about and John has done, where we are trying to significantly divert offenders from coming into the system, but even if they come in, we need to understand that this is the area where we either, I think, succeed or fail in our approach to criminal justice and our ability to better manage this issue of mass incarceration. And that is, and I frankly don't think a lot of people talk about that, but it is the most obvious thing to me, and why when Nitin and I started, I wanted to tackle reforming the criminal court, which is a court that I was a DA in '82. Literally everyone said, there's nothing you can do. We don't have enough judges, or it's this person's problem. No one wants to own the problem of delivering effective intervention with young men and women coming into our justice system. And until we make that commitment and provide that resource, I think what we will see is this cycling in and out of young men and women, ultimately to a point where they're going to be treated as felons and then end up in state prison. I do think that this is a problem that can be solved, but I think it first takes a recognition that we need to acknowledge that I believe our problem is in how we are treating young men and women at the beginning of their lives as they bump up against our system.
So let's, if we're going to have an honest discussion about race in the criminal justice system, let's include in that discussion the disparate impact of crime on victims of color as well. Okay, so that's, if our Homicide Review Commission has looked at for the last about 8 years, both non-fatal shootings and homicides. And what have those studies shown us? That our victims and our offenders are the same people. They're the same people. 80% of our victims have prior criminal records. You know, the relationship, as Cy just mentioned, to exposure to childhood violence, whether they were abused themselves, sexually mistreated, whether they were exposed to domestic violence. Again, that accounts for about 80% of our violent offenders when we do the detailed studies. We've got a significant problem. Okay, we've already had 75 homicides in the city of Milwaukee. We're 600,000 people. You know, I shudder when I even compare it to Manhattan. You know, it doesn't compare favorably. I'm going to tell you that much right now. We've had 500 non-fatal shootings in the city of Milwaukee, and these are good years. These are good years. for Milwaukee. We're actually pushing down those numbers. So that concerns the community. It rightfully concerns the community. At the same time, we have to do a better job of distinguishing between the two categories of people that come into every criminal justice system, and there really are only two categories: those who scare us and those who habitually irritate the hell out of us. That's really what it comes down to. About 10% of the people are the scary people. About the other 90% are people that are coming in for a combination of different reasons. They're youthful offenders who've grown up in constrained circumstances. They make bad short-term decisions that have long-term negative consequences, a classic prisoner's dilemma. You've got mentally ill individuals. You've got substance abuse. You have co-occurring substance abuse, mental illness, and on top of that, you have a great deal of alcohol problems, particularly in the state of Wisconsin. The reality is, any one of those four categories is going to result in some kind of response from the criminal justice system, rightfully so. Now, how we respond can make all the difference in the world. You look at, so if we're spending about $1 billion a year in the state of Wisconsin, so on a biannual basis, it's $2.2 billion, of which every year about $300 million is spent in Milwaukee for corrections, and it's primarily concentrated. If you look at Eric Adora's justice mapping, he's worked in Wisconsin. It's concentrated in about 3 aldermanic districts on the north side. Not completely, but the lion's share of our corrections dollars go into a limited geographic area. The exact same areas, by the way, that we have our homicides, our shootings, our drug dealing, our poor performing schools, our highest rates of poverty, the lowest home ownership, the highest teen pregnancy, if I didn't mention that already. All of these co-occurring, the lowest access to health care, all of these things occur in these concentrated areas. Other than that, Milwaukee is really a great city, and I mean that. I mean that. It is a wonderful city. It's got everything it needs to be a vibrant, prosperous. But when you look at these deeply crime-impacted communities, they have lost the capacity to regulate themselves to a certain extent, and I think we've exacerbated that through some of our criminal justice policies. If you haul 3,000 primarily African American men out of that community every year, and then every year 3,000 come right back in from the corrections system, you destabilize a community after a while. And if that's been going on for 10, 15, 20 years, you can see the generational impact of that. So when Cy's talking about getting to the heart of it, one thing you can do, just last month we broke ground on a peace center where it's not going to be the traditional model. We actually have Children's Hospital going to co-locate with our domestic violence service provider and our entire sensitive crimes unit and my domestic violence prosecutors. They're going to be located out in the community, not in the courthouse. And entire families are going to be served. And they're going to be served with the very specific aim of when a family is exposed to violence, let's treat it like a public health crisis right then and there. Heroin epidemic is a huge problem right now, but I would argue that violence is every bit as powerful and addictive and brain changing and all those things as heroin and drugs are, and that's what we experience. You expose people to violence, and they change, they behave differently, and we've got to get upstream on that and stop it as soon as we possibly can. And then by doing that, those are families of, there's no question, those are our African American, our Hispanic and Latino families that disproportionately experience that. And so by taking that public health approach and doing it in a very conscientious and structured way, I think that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll look back and we say, we finally got something right. By addressing these as public health issues, we finally got something right.
Okay, I have lots of questions. I could keep going, but it wouldn't be fair. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Mr. Stewart.
Following up on your last point, John, about how 5-10 years down the road you want to look back and see all the good that has happened, how can you both institutionalize the changes that you've made so that after you leave office, they're still there, and the next person doesn't come in and change it all back?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really cannot be driven by personality. It's got to be done by consensus, and that's where I mentioned the Community Justice Council concept. You can call it what you want, but everybody in the community has to essentially come together and agree on some basics. And that's the leadership. That's the leadership in your community has to agree on at least 90% of these things. And it's okay if you have an outlier. I have a sheriff that he's the only sheriff or the only member of the Community Justice Councils that actually writes letters suggesting that we not get grants when we apply for them. So it's because why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because if he heard something that Jim said about binary regression analysis, that's all he needs. That's social. That's social engineering nonsense. You just need to get tough on these guys, and you need to put more of them in jail and more in prison, and stop all this soft on crime nonsense. Right? I have to live with that. We've got fairly rabid right-wing radio in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin, and I'm personified as the soft on crime guy. And my response to that is, just explain one thing to me. How can we have the highest incarceration rate in the country, and yet I'm still soft on crime? I don't get that. And so, but that's what you have to be willing to take on. And I think by institutionalizing it in entities like the Community Justice Council, it becomes less personality driven and it becomes more ingrained. And quite frankly, when you start saving a lot of money and keeping violent crime rates down, that's where you actually see a convergence between whether you're a social justice liberal or a fiscal conservative. It all comes together if you can demonstrate that you're doing things that actually keep the community safe and you're doing it at much lower cost and much more effectively. And that is what I'm about, quite frankly. I think that we can demonstrate that we're on the road to doing that. And by significantly reducing the number of people that are in our jails and in our prisons, at the same time reducing the violent crime rates, it's tough to argue against that.
Yes.
As this hopefully becomes more of a national discussion, I'm curious how prosecutors across the country are addressing this soft on crime problem. You can't really get elected if the community sees it out of soft on crime and all they want, especially in major cities, all they want is tough on crime. How is that discussion developing within prosecutors?
There's actually a movement in the country called Right on Crime. And heroin. So if it was cocaine, if it was crack cocaine, then everyone was supposed to be tough on crime, and we'd give you lots of money to be tough on crime because that was primarily African American drug dealers and users, right? Well, guess what? Heroin suddenly when all the suburbs have their kids dropping dead from overdoses, we're suddenly getting legislation at the state level that's suddenly looking very progressive. Very progressive, and that's important. That's good. That's a good thing. So that's one aspect is when people across all spectrums are impacted with the same thing, and you can come forward and you can say we've got a system in place that can address this problem across all spectrums. Then the same thing is true with how we approach crime problems in general. It shouldn't be broken down into major cities. You have to some extent. A small county isn't going to have the same issues and resources, quite frankly, as a larger county. So you have to have some templates in place that can be modified, and you have to make them unique to each jurisdiction. But I think prosecutors across the country are beginning to understand that that's part of their responsibility now. Is we're not, like I said, we're not just case processors. We're supposed to be problem solvers now. That's one of our obligations, and it's even recognized by the ABA as the special obligation of a prosecutor right now. It's to help your community solve their problems.
And from my perspective, to say it differently, I think it's my job is crime fighting, and all that entails. And I believe that if you are in your job, being effective in the courtroom, and doing a good job on combating violent crime, that's important. I mean, if a DA wants to get reelected, they're going to have to pay attention to serious violent street crime, or you're not long for that office. But I also believe that people are very open to a very simple proposition. Which would you prefer, to prosecute a robbery or to prevent it? The end result is, if you can lower crime by preventing a robbery from occurring, that's a worthwhile devotion of resources, even from a DA's office. And as we now start to understand how we can use our levers to engage in crime prevention strategies that ultimately, as in Manhattan, for the last 4 years, have been knocking down violent crime rates. So we are a jurisdiction of 1.6 million people at bedtime and 3.6 million people at work time. We have had, how many homicides this year, Nitin? 30? 30. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
But that's not an accident. That's not an accident. That's a lot of focused work by a lot of players in the criminal justice system. And so I think the soft on crime argument will always be there. It will always be part of the left-right debate. But in the middle, both the left and the right understand that they want results. And if crime prevention strategies, for example, we fund we have 3,500 kids. 3 years ago, there was something called the Police Athletic League Center in central Manhattan that was closed, didn't have money to open its gym on Friday and Saturday nights. And we thought that was just ridiculous. And so what we decided to do was to use forfeiture dollars from drug cases and go in and set up a sports program for that location. And it's very important to have exceptional sports programming. So we brought exceptional trainers in. So that little program, starting from nothing, now has about 3,500 kids who have joined. And on Friday and Saturday nights in Manhattan, in 7 different locations, you'll see boys and girls 12 to 18 years old, 5 to 9 p.m. Friday to Saturday's night, in places having a phenomenal experience. That's crime fighting. And I can go with the chief of the gang unit and sit at the side of the court, and he'll tell me, that guy's a member of this gang, that guy's a member of this other gang. And what we are doing is breaking down these community law enforcement divides and also gang against gang divides. Now, I haven't told that story to anybody who doesn't think that's not a good idea, conservative or not. It's common sense, and at a certain point, DAs have to start flexing the muscles that they have in the power of their office and the tools they have, and it's not a zero-sum game for us anymore. And I think people understand that, and I think actually people want it.
Yes.
You touched on this a little. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in depth about your relationship with various law enforcement officials, specifically. Mr. Vance, you mentioned the Chief of Police, and you mentioned the sheriff, and how that can be either a challenge or it can be very helpful. They sort of act as almost gatekeepers to the system. So, what role do they play, and how do you sort of manage that relationship vis-a-vis some of these issues?
Well, it's absolutely critical. The reality is that the most important relationship that I have is generally with the city of Milwaukee's police chief. The sheriff's department itself is relatively small by comparison, and their primary function is patrolling the freeways and safeguarding the jails and the courthouse. And they they've actually gotten smaller, and they have much less of a crime-fighting footprint than they've had in the past. Chief Flynn is the police chief of the city of Milwaukee. He is nationally recognized. He is a Bratton disciple, so you're essentially talking about people coming from the same philosophy, which is clearly very well centered, and again, evidence-based approaches, measuring how they do it, and making sure that they have a strong, visible presence to reduce, and I will quote him now, crime, fear, and disorder. I mean, but he drills it into his people each and every day. But that does not mean we agree on everything. And I don't think that any prosecutor, any elected prosecutor will ever agree with all of his law enforcement partners all the time. It's almost impossible to do so. Even the sheriff, even though we disagree, I mean, he will oftentimes publicly state that, look, it's easy for him. He says, I get to be black and white. You know, I'm a cop. I get to be black and white. But he will acknowledge that that's not what prosecutors do. We have to operate in and I don't look at them as gray areas, but it's our constitutionally mandated requirement that A, we don't charge people we can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt. B, we treat both our victims and our defendants with respect. We have an obligation to make sure that the entire system, we protect the integrity of the entire system. So we have a quasi-judicial obligation as part of our role. I think that makes us fairly unique in the world of elected officials, quite frankly. Like I often like to say that, that as elected officials, we have one disadvantage that most politicians don't, and that is that we can't lie to anybody. And so it's fundamentally we either have to tell them the truth or say nothing at all, and oftentimes there's good reasons why we can't say anything at all, and that can be very frustrating. If you're operating under court orders that require, if it's sensitive information, or you have privacy issues related to your victims, it's often very limited what information you can give, and that can be very frustrating because if you feel that the information is being spun a bad direction, and it sometimes is by police departments as well. They want to respond to things when they happen. For example, it's not uncommon if you have an uptick in shootings that a press release will come out from the police indicating that this person has been arrested 20 times before, and then they just leave it at that, and then immediately the press comes swarming down on us and says, why hasn't this person been prosecuted? Are you guys soft on crime? Well, there's a distinction between arrest and presentation for prosecution, and sometimes they don't make that distinction themselves. And so the upshot of it all is that you have to have a very close professional relationship with your law enforcement partners, but you also have to understand that our role is different, and sometimes and the most difficult strain in that relationship is when you have to charge police officers. That's one of the single most difficult things that occurs, because there's no magical entity out there that swoops in and handles a police misconduct case. There's no independent agency that is going to magically appear, and there's no independent prosecutorial unit that's going to handle that case. Your obligation is to review the case as you would any other, and if there's been misconduct, your obligation is to pursue that, and do that in the same way you would any other offense. So that was one of the reasons, for example, that I put an emphasis on public integrity within our office. It applied both to police misconduct, it applied to political misconduct, and issues related to our electoral process as well, because the expectation of the community is those who are given the most discretion and authority should use it wisely and should use it appropriately and legally, and when they don't do that, they should be held accountable like anybody else.
If you have a good working relationship with the police, life is much easier. When you have challenges in the relationship, I think it's important to try to solve them without lowering your standards or goals as a prosecutor. And I think some very simple things are sometimes important, which is to have regular communications with the Commissioner of Police. I used to have every other month breakfast with Ray Kelly. Ray really didn't know who I was when I came in, didn't know what to expect. And I think in the beginning, he was getting told by his senior executives whatever they thought their view was. And likewise for me, and ultimately I think we were both being portrayed, perhaps not accurately, by our senior staff, and it was causing him to, I think, to rise up and get upset about things that were not necessary. And so I found regular meetings where I could say to him, so what's on your mind, anything bothering you? And he'd tell me what was bothering him, and I'd say, you're wrong, this is why, 1, 2, 3. And we became good partners, but it took, I think you have to own that relationship yourself as the DA and not hand it to anybody else. But I think it's your obligation really to have the best working relationship you can with the police department without, of course you have to be, and we often do, disagree with them.
In the back.
I have one question. How do you think that the appeals division can better serve the district attorney's office as a whole? Or what changes have you tried to implement?
I'm participating right now in an NIJ program called the Sentinel Events Project. And what it is in a nutshell, they've asked several jurisdictions, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Milwaukee, to select an area where there was a system failure and to do a detailed after-action review, bring together all the system and non-system players and really break down what did or didn't happen. Interestingly enough, when I agreed to do that, the first call I got was from the Attorney General's office, their appellate division, and they wanted to participate because their fundamental belief is that if DA's offices would do more of the kind of work that SI has done, for example, and setting up checklist protocols to avoid systemic errors and mistake, that it would number one, reduce the number of cases that would be overturned on appeal, but most importantly, it would just produce better results in the get-go. So that's one thing. I would say just to have a more active role, quite frankly. I think most people perceive appellate work as being passive. I don't think it should be passive. I think one of the best things young attorneys can do, quite frankly, is start off doing some appellate work. I started off representing prisoners when I was in law school in our maximum security, doing some appellate work for them and other types of work. And I've always told the young people that I hire that, before you send somebody off to maximum security prison, you ought to spend a couple days in the maximum security prison, and there's no better way of understanding the seriousness of the consequence of what you're going to do as a prosecutor. But I also thought the appellate work, doing that even as a law student, made me a better prosecutor when I showed up in court the first time, and I had to remember that everything I said was actually going to be recorded and reviewed and all that stuff. But I would say just take a more active role and actually point out the most common things that you see that lead to mistakes.
Well, our appeals division is hugely important to us, and we have a big and I think excellent group of appeals lawyers. I can't imagine, frankly, us doing our job without having a division of that substance and size. We handle all our own appeals. I'm not sure that's the way it is with all other offices, but we handle all our own appeals, and we really don't leave trying to shape the appeals law to anyone outside our office. And I'm very often calling in the head of our appeals division to talk me through or to participate in policy discussions or decisions on cases that could have implications on developing law, good or bad for us. And I couldn't imagine not having a strong appeals bureau as part of our work.
I want to pick up on Mr. Chisholm's point about prosecuting police. It's a very difficult thing to do, and I wonder what you think of having some kind of outside mandated investigative and prosecuting unit. And I think Wisconsin has a new law about that. I wonder if you have thoughts about whether that works, should work.
Yeah, they did a half measure, quite frankly. I'm sorry to say that. Sure. So there's nothing that will upset a community more than an officer-involved shooting that they perceive as not being justified. That's been true. I know that I go back to it. I think within the first month of being elected in 2007, I was confident at the time there was a significant event that had occurred involving police officers beating up an African-American gentleman who, and it resulted in a failed state prosecution and ultimately a successful federal civil rights prosecution. But it caused an enormous amount of tension and distrust in the community. And so I remember saying at the time that, look, in the ideal world, you'd have a group of 50 retired homicide investigators from multiple jurisdictions that would be waiting on call to handle any police misconduct or officer involved shooting, and the case would be independently reviewed by a separate law enforcement or prosecution office, or ideally the Attorney General's office. That would be ideal. It just doesn't exist. I don't know if it exists anywhere. So what we did is we did a half measure. It requires an independent lead investigative agency. They just have to be the lead. It is not done completely independent. And so that would be the ideal thing, quite frankly. Now, some jurisdictions have established multi-jurisdictional shoot teams, things like that. But the reality is that, in the case, in our most recent case, for example, after they passed that law, I asked the state's Division of Criminal Investigation to become the lead investigator on that. The Milwaukee Police Department asked them to do it. So they came in to do that. It was in downtown Milwaukee at 4:30 in the afternoon. And you had over 100 witnesses, right? And they had 8 investigators available at the time. So what do you do with something like that? You can't just seal off the downtown and wait for 14 hours to assemble a team. So they took over as a lead investigator, but we have we're going to be criticized. We have received criticism because like 3 or 4 of them are retired Milwaukee police detectives, and they were hired because of their expertise in homicide investigations, which, as you've noticed, we tend to get a lot of experience in those. And so that's, but that's just, if there's any one issue that I find that you simply cannot win on, it's those. So what, at the end of the day, what you do is you do a professional investigation and you bring as much objective outside evaluation as you can to it, and then you make the call based on what the facts are, what the law is, and what your ethical obligation is, and then you live with it. You live with that decision.
In Manhattan, all police-involved shootings will go into a grand jury. So that's not the answer to all the issues, but we do that because we believe that is an appropriate safeguard to a challenge that we are not might not look seriously at an investigation involving a police who discharged his firearm and hit somebody or killed somebody. And that's besides having an official corruption unit and besides prosecuting police officers for a whole range of misconduct, these very difficult cases that we've seen recently, I think our approach is to make sure that there is a uniform way that the public knows we'll handle them, and then to make sure that we do the most professional job that we can do.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time. So please join me in thanking Mr. Vance, Mr. Chisholm.